Welcome to Designing Cities for All, another episode, and it's part of a 2-year-long activity and research program
where we take a deep dive into designing products, spaces, and systems for all. Just because you feel safe or you feel welcome or you feel included doesn't mean that everyone else around you feels the same way.
We don't stand alone. We're not individuals that somehow a planet or an island, you know? And I think that's the beautiful thing of a diverse society, that everyone can add something from out of their own experience.
Things won't change just if we just let things happen.
I think if you can build relationships and use design as a tool to build those relationships, the better off we're all going to be.
Everything around us was once designed and can therefore be redesigned. Belonging is a very, very important concept.
You can try to take someone's place for a while, but you don't have the lived experience.
Let's begin by acknowledging similarity and affinity.
Be a person, not your role.
I think inclusion is not a choice.
Inclusion happens by design or not at all.
In order to create truly inclusive public spaces that are accessible to everyone, we have to underline what everyone actually is.
Real inclusion, it's got nothing to do with the norm, but it's like something that we create from all different perspectives.
You know, so even when we bring everybody at the table, does everybody's voice count the same?
Because it's a big question of who tells these stories.
You know, the more I explore about other cultures, other religions, is the more ingredients I have to make the architecture and to answer the questions I get from society.
Not fitting in was a blessing, or I would have turned out just like you.
Hello. Just before I welcome you officially to this program, a couple of practical issues. First of all, we have live subtitles. So if you go to our program page, you will find the button very easily, and you can put the subtitles on. The other thing is you just saw the wrap-up of the first year of Designing Cities for All. And the third thing is, as you probably can hear, English is not my first language. As a matter of fact, as someone who is born in Iran, spent the first 18 years in Iran and now 35 years in Holland, I have no idea what my first or second language is. But as long as you can hear me and I can look at the people in the place, can you hear me properly? Can you understand what my way of pronunciation? And they all nod like this. Okay, cool. I'm glad to hear that, to see that. And having said that, hello, and welcome. Welcome, my name is Baram Sadeghi. I have the great honor and great responsibility to be your moderator, your host tonight for Designing Cities for All. It's our 2-year-long research and activity program in which we take a deep dive into designing products, places, systems for all. And we always have designers, many designers, scientists, experts, educational institutions, and other people who are involved in partners who are involved in participating. We also have had 6 fellows to curate program, part of this program. And we are so glad, honored, and happy to welcome Daphina Misiedjan as our next fellow. Great to have you here, Daphina.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and so in your Designing Cities for All Fellowship, you are an expert on environmental justice and human rights, and we hope that you can lead us in how we can design or maybe redesign laws and the environment to become more inclusive. Next to you, we have 2 more people here in the room, Verisa Lenters and Robert Fonk. I will introduce you, of course, later properly. And we are so glad and honored as well that we have an justice and environmental sustainability expert, Julian Achiman, who is right now with us through Zoom and who is now in Boston. Is that right, Julian? Are you in Boston, actually? Julian?
Yeah, I'm in the Boston metro area. I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is where Harvard and MIT are. So I'm just across the river from Boston, yeah.
Okay, great to have you, and I'm so glad that we can hear you properly. The technical technique goes for works for us. And if you think, okay, they have a great room, great table with great people, and so be here in the room, or people who are watching the program online, we can just sit back, and watch it, or maybe watch our, check our Insta like someone is doing right now over there. No, you can do that, but not. So if you are watching this program online, go to menti.com, and you have a very simple way to participate. So please go to menti.com, and you will see a code. So that's the code you will see, 10752200. I repeat, if you go to menti.com, you will see you can enter the code 10752200. And for the people here, in about, let's say, half an hour, we will start the conversation after 4 introductions, so you can ask a question. But please wait for my colleague who will come to you with a microphone, handheld microphone, so every other people at home, they can hear you. Now we can have a talk. Am I right, Mrs. Jan? Okay. Daphina, first of all, tell me about your background. What do you do? What's your official title? And as a matter of fact, what do you do on a daily basis?
Yes.
What's your official title?
My name is Daphina Misiedjan, indeed. So I'm an assistant professor in human rights and the environment at the Erasmus University here in Rotterdam. And I look at issues such as access to clean air, access to water, issues around climate justice. And that is also some of the topics that I will be discussing today and in the upcoming weeks.
Yeah. So, the first topic, you wanted to have discussion about was about complex inequality.
Yes.
So, what does that mean, complex inequality? Can you give us an example of that?
Yes, so I first came across this topic when I wanted to figure out, okay, I understand that unfortunately not everyone is experiencing the environment in the same way. Some people are more vulnerable or made more vulnerable, and I wanted to understand what exactly makes that, or how does that come about. And I first started to looking at where people lived. So I looked at, for instance, air quality, and I thought, okay, indeed, where you live influences whether or not you have access to clean air. But then I also had to look at, do people have access to healthcare? Because that then comes into play, because if people become sick, do they have the opportunity to then go to the hospital or go to their general practitioner to have some support? Then I also had to look at, do they have information about whether or not the environment around them is polluted? So there were all these issues that were tying into each other. And that is how I also came across a report by the Public Health Organization. I'm just going to say it like that, and you will say the official title.
Is it our RIVM?
Yes. No. The RVS, so the Raad voor... Samenleving en Gezondheid.
Yeah, because now you're looking at Robert, because
yes.
Robert Funk is one of our, later he will have a talk with us as well.
He will explain a little bit about
and
that.
you are right now with
the Council for Health and Society.
Oh, yeah, and in Dutch we call it...
De Raad voor Volksgezondheid en Samenleving.
Yeah, so you presented your report to them?
No, I saw their report on complex inequality, which looked at how individuals were experiencing these inequalities, and that it's also issues such as stress that relates to the different health outcomes that we have. So in the Netherlands, we do experience, unfortunately, different health outcomes for different communities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To be honest, when the first time I heard about you and your research, and you would come here, it was for me. Although I sometimes have the idea that I know what's going around in the world
Mm-hmm.
or in Holland I heard about that environmental inequality. I thought what even environmental is discriminating people. Can you imagine for us ordinary people that it was a kind of not, I wouldn't say weird, but kind of different to hear about the topic.
Yes, I can understand that because especially here in the Dutch context, we don't really talk about that type of inequality. And we also don't have a lot of information about our environment and how it impacts us. I
When it rains, we get all wet.
Yes.
When it's a bad, bad air, we all get, we have to cough, But then you say, no.
Yeah, some
there
of
is a
us have umbrellas. Some of us have access to healthcare.
Yeah.
Some of us are actually building or living in constructions that will protect them.
Yeah.
So that really differs. And also here in the Netherlands, people actually use years of their lives because of environmental issues and how that impacts their health.
Yeah. So now I know a little bit about your background, why we are here. Just very briefly, why did you decide to invite these three people, Julian in Boston, I will have a conversation shortly with him, and Virisa and Robert.
Yes, because I think they really complement each other. And also because I wanted to approach this from an interdisciplinary perspective. So Julian will talk to us more about how to design, so how design comes into that. He also has case studies not only in the US, but also here in the Netherlands. He also looks at Amsterdam, for instance. Yeah. So that will be very interesting to look at. And then we will talk about air quality and also about how other issues around us influence our health. So that relates to the health part. And then also to how these things interact. So the complexity of all these issues.
Cool. I guess you have made a really great lineup, and
I
I hope so too. Yeah, and as I already said, so in about half an hour we will have room for questions from the audience and also menti.com. Having said that, I'm going to go to Boston, Massachusetts. Julian Achiman, and who you are a social justice and environmental sustainability expert, and you have talked about, you have developed the notion of just sustainabilities. Could you please tell us, a little bit, in layman, way, what's that about,
Well, thank you. And before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm on the stolen land of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, to their past, their present, and their future, and enter into an agreement of respect as part of this meeting. Cool. Just sustainabilities. Okay. The very quick answer. The word sustainability has been around for at least 40 years. I first came across it in 1980 in the World Conservation Strategy of the World Wildlife Fund. It was predominantly then, and really until the last 10 years, it's been primarily focused around environmental sustainability. Nothing wrong with that. If you went out onto the streets of Amsterdam, or I went to the streets of Boston and said, what is sustainability? 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 people would say, well, it's about the environment. And I'd say, yeah, it is, but it's about more than just the environment. We could legislate, we could make laws for a green planet. But if it wasn't socially just, would it be sustainable? For instance, Minneapolis is one of the greenest cities, like Portland, Oregon. Minneapolis is one of the greenest cities in the United States. And yet, look at what's happening in Minneapolis. Green does not mean socially just. We need to add social justice to sustainability, hence the concept of just sustainabilities. And what's really interesting for me now is that I've taught a class on just sustainabilities for 20 years at Tufts. And some of my students that took that class 20 years ago said, hey, I really enjoyed your class then, but I really know now what you're talking about. And I'm noticing a much greater interest from urban planners, from sustainability specialists on intersections between social justice and sustainability. So, I can go into a whole range of things about just sustainabilities, but I'm guessing they're going to come up as part of the conversation.
Yeah. Julian, by the way, just to be clear, you mentioned Minneapolis as one of the greenest cities in the United States. and yet look what's happening over there. Why do you mention that? What's the contrary to that notion of greenness?
Okay, so I was telling you that basically, we can have a green world. We could legislate for environmental sustainability, but if we didn't also legislate for social justice, we would not have a sustainable world, because green cities do not mean socially just cities. Minneapolis is one of the most unequal cities in the United States from a race point of view, in terms of income, in terms of wealth, which is basically home ownership, in terms of achievement in schools. Minneapolis is way down there. So why is this? Why is a city that is so green, has the best park systems in the United States, has the third most bicycle commuters, has the best running tracks and spaces for recreation? How is it then that that green city is still a deeply racist city? There is no correlation between greening and a city becoming less racist. So just sustainability really centers both social justice and equity and environmental sustainability.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Justice is not a sort of second order thing that comes after environmental and economic issues have been worked out. We have to center social justice and sustainabilty.
Yeah. Thank you for this, unfortunately, very good example to make your point. And final question for now, correct me if I'm wrong, but you did a case study about Amsterdam. And in your book, a case of truly smart and sustainable cities, and you mentioned Amsterdam as well. So my final question is, what can we learn of your findings about redesigning cities into cities of belonging?
Yes, so the book was called Sharing Cities, A Case for Truly Smart and Sustainable Cities. This was 2015. And we were looking at how do we shift away from the sharing economy, which is still a transactional economy. In fact, what has it got to do with sharing anymore? Towards the notion of the sharing city. Cities were always shared spaces, way back into prehistory. We looked at various cities. One was Copenhagen, Medellin, Colombia, Bangalore, India. We looked at Amsterdam because you have a very thriving smart city network, and you, I think, were the first city in Europe to declare being a sharing city. And we looked at Amsterdam because traditionally, you've been seen as a very accommodating city in the sense that immigrants, have traditionally been welcomed. I know there are all kinds of problems throughout European cities at the moment. Cities that were once tolerant are now being tested. But we really liked the idea that Amsterdam was a city that was thinking about sharing, about being smart. And smart wasn't just about wiring up the city. Smart was about, we thought, increasing the capacities and capabilities of citizens to achieve good lives. So we like it from that point of view. I also, since the case study, have been in touch with Kate Raworth, the donut economy person. And Kate, I know, is working with the city on looking at, the local donut. How can Amsterdam use the donut to plan for a more just and sustainable future? So in all of these cases, I think, Amsterdam is quite impressive. And along with Barcelona, you're looking at issues of data sovereignty, which we thought was quite impressive. Many cities are not really looking at data sovereignty. They're just collecting data and not telling people what they're doing with it. So on many factors, Amsterdam stood out to us as being a city that really was engaging with the notion of sharing, with the notion of smartness, and the notion of just sustainabilities.
Yeah, Cool. Thank you. And of course, you will stay with us for the next round when we have a conversation with all for you together. And so now we go to Verisa Lenters, Assistant Professor in Environmental Epidemiology at University Medical Center Utrecht. And you had this notion of exposum or exposum. How would you pronounce that, and what does it mean?
Some people say exposome, and there's different arguments about how we should be pronouncing it. But exposome science is, I'm an environmental epidemiologist. I'm looking at how pollution and other environmental factors affect health. The idea of exposome science is we're going to do a better job of measuring everything, and working better with other fields to better do that. So about 10, 15 years ago, this concept came up where we'd like to invest more in tools to measure things better. So we did a good job of mapping the genome. We know what genes we have in our body, but we can't do much about that beyond CRISPR and some fancy technologies. Most of us are not going to do much about our genes. And we'd like to better address the modifiable risk factors. So what are the things like pollution that are making us sick, but what are also the social determinants that are making somebody more susceptible to pollution, or what are the behavioral nudges we could all use to make different choices, or that would enable more accessibility to healthier choices and better designed cities. So exposome science was using new tools to measure things and new ways of looking at the impact of all the factors that are non-genetic on our health, and also through our whole lifetime. So it's a lot of mumbo-jumbo terms maybe, but in the end, exposome science is, I think, about giving more investments into looking at not just exposures in isolation, but more systems thinking and tools to address that.
So you just mentioned maybe two of main factors you are measuring. You said pollution.
Yeah.
And what were the other things?
So
because you said we are measuring everything.
Yeah, it's ambitious. We're going to do everything, and everyone will be completely quantified. That's the goal.
Yeah.
But I think the beauty of exposome science is that we need to work in transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary teams. So my small niche is looking at environmental pollution, things like air quality, but also chemicals that come from our daily products, from pesticides, and how that affects child and reproductive health.
Yeah, and you also use the so-called citizen science as a research and intervention tool. Could you please tell us more about this, and how could people get access to those tools, or the tools are getting access to us?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think privacy and data is something we could definitely touch on in this evening. Yeah. One of the things we're doing is we're giving people sensors in our studies usually. So this is still usually in the context of a study where somebody will agree to work with us, and then we do something like take a drop of blood, and we'll tell you what sort of chemicals do you have, what have built up, what level of pesticides or plastic associated chemicals do you have, and I think the tricky thing there, well, one is this, it's helpful to know what sort of exposures you have, I think. We can make different choices, but a very tricky thing is, what do we do with that information? How do we communicate those risks carefully? So in the news last week, it was about sunscreen. Some people are arguing, be careful about sunscreen. There's risks associated with that. And I think there was some response very strongly, oh no, we need sunscreen, it causes cancer. But I think that response was maybe unjust, that we need to acknowledge that people are worried about some of the exposures that they have in their life. And we shouldn't ridicule or dismiss that. I think I would hope that we feel more empowered to make choices that are healthy, but also not putting the onus on people to figure out all those different magnitudes of risks. But just to sum up, I think the sensors that we're putting, for instance, on bikes to go see what your air pollution is in your neighborhood on your route to work, little drops of blood or other urinary samples or other samples that we can get, and we can give you a sort of chemical screen and of your metabolites and all sorts of chemicals that signal in your body. And the last example, I think, would be some apps that we're using at Utrecht University and UMCU, where we can have somebody going throughout their daily life. And we can, what we call ecological momentary assessments. We ask you, how do you feel now?
How do you call it?
Yeah, just basically we pause you in a moment, unexpected moment, and we ask, how do you feel? And I think when it comes to urban design. This is important. We design often maybe top down, but we don't know a lot about perception or how people feel in a moment and what is contributing to their stress or how they perceive a place. So we're using more interactive technologies to not just a boring questionnaire that someone has to fill out over 2 hours, but take a break at moments in time and ask them how do you feel in this space.
And that's the only question you ask then?
We can ask a lot of different questions, but I think that's an important one. Yeah, that's a simple one.
Okay, now I ask you, how do you feel right now?
I feel good. The temperature is okay. The lighting is a little bit intense, but
harsh,
that is, I guess, for at home. But I'm doing good. Yeah.
How do you feel like right now?
Yeah, good.
What do you mean? What do you mean good?
Yeah.
Robert, how do you feel right now? So is that the way you ask them? You just interrupt them in their daily state of mind?
I think the idea is a bit of an interruption, so that it's not the participant is forced to respond then, but it's to catch people in different moments, not when you maybe would give a response that's
socially accepted.
Yeah,
often also.
Okay, good. Okay, Robert. First of all, how do you feel right now?
A bit tense.
A bit tense. Okay. Robert Funk, Senior Advisor, Council for Public Health and Society, zogenaamd Raad voor Volksgezondheid en Samenleving. And you look at the health disadvantages. That's your job in different demographics and regions in Holland. Could you please give us an example of those disadvantages?
Well, there are a lot of examples. For example, the place where we live, like the actual street or area of the city where we live, influences our health. For example, by the quality of the air in your neighborhood, or the water quality, or even sound, like sound pollution. I'm not sure if it's a proper English term, but
we do have all. In Holland, the same quality of water. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Not
you're
really.
wrong.
Yes.
I'm wrong?
Yeah.
Oh my
That's
God.
not true. Some people have more lead in their water because of the piping. Some people have, because we also don't all get the same water from the same place.
And am I the only one who didn't know that, or do you see this? Let me see, people in the room, just to be, now you know the answer. But let's say 30 seconds ago, did you know that we have different qualities of water in Holland? Please raise your hand if you knew that. Oh, a couple of people, they knew that. They know, okay, cool to know. I'm keeping an eye on you. Okay, Robert, please go on.
Yeah, I think so. What we're talking about as a council is, or what we try to convey to policymakers is the notion that health is not decided or influenced only by your individual behavior. It's also influenced, maybe for a larger part or a more important part, by social conditions. So it's about the conditions in which you were born, or in which you work, where you live, or where you age, right? So it's the place where you spend your life that also influences how healthy you are, but also how healthy you can be. And that's not only like a physical thing, it's also a social thing. So the unequal distribution of power, for example, or income or resources also influences your health.
Your health, or would you say your well-being? Is it the same?
Well, there's of course, I think they're the same because, for example, if you take into account mental health and well-being and health, and how we talk about health, how ordinary people talk about health, that usually talk about well-being. So well-being is a part, as far as I'm concerned, of how healthy you are and how healthy you can be.
Final question for you. How about, because, most of programs we make, in this podcast is all about the cities, or the metropolitan, environment, What's the role of the cities in having qualities or inequalities?
Well, it's a bit of a tricky question because there are various levels of inequality that accumulate in a
What
single
pops
life.
up to your mind when you think about cities and inequality?
I think it's not only when you look at what cities or municipalities can do. It's not only about designing cities well. For example, in the green and blue area, so in parks and water. It's also about the social construction or the social makeup of a city. You know, in the Netherlands, municipalities have a large responsibility in social support, organizing social support, organizing income security, and those things are very important for people. They form the basis of health for a lot of people. Well, for everyone actually. And municipalities cities have a great responsibility in that area as well.
Okay, just because now we know a little bit about your fourth of you, about your background and how you in this subject. Just to remind you, as I said, now it's about time. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and my colleague will come to you with a microphone. You can ask your question in the microphone. And for the people who are watching at home, online, please go to menti.com, and the code is 10752200. So if you go to menti.com, 10752200, and they will send a question to me, and I will get it here on my laptop, and I will pass the question to you. Having said that, now we talked a little bit about, like a meta level, about other people, and I wonder, when you know all this stuff, what does it do to you and your people, your environment, Let me start, because we had Julian about 20 minutes ago. When it comes to, because you are originally from United Kingdom, am I right? You are born there, and you you went to college. The first years you were in United Kingdom, and now you are in Boston. And I wonder, when it comes, for example, to city versus countryside, with all the things where would you like to live?
Well, where I live now, in the city. I'm an inveterate city dweller. I love going to the countryside, but I'm a city dweller. I love the city. I am seduced by the city. I like difference and diversity. I like meeting people that I wouldn't ordinarily meet. So the city is the place for me,
Okay, just to get it right, despite the fact that that the cities are on average, I guess, 4 Celsius degrees or warmer than only maybe 10 kilometers outside the city, air pollution, and also the probably inequality in the city is much higher. Despite all those facts, or maybe even bad water, you prefer to live in the city. Am I right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. We get that. Okay. Just very final question for you.
Yeah.
But in general, I don't want to point something, when you know all this stuff, what does it mean to you on a basic, human micro level?
Well, I think it means that you start thinking about indeed those risks. I think what was mentioned as well, because you indeed know that there is an issue with everything. So what do you choose? What do you choose to do? Do you indeed say, okay, I'm going to drink this water from this plastic cup, even though I know the plastic probably leaked into the water? Or will I go and jog next to the highway? I'm just making up examples.
Yeah.
So you think about the things that you do, but you also know that what Robert also said, it's not necessarily always the individual choices. It's sometimes you don't have the opportunity to make a choice on how it affects your health.
Or the luxury to make a choice.
Yeah, the luxury or the structure that you need.
Okay.
And I think, just to come back to your question about cities versus rural, I think Robert can also tell you a little bit about that even also the rural area is having a lot of issues when it comes to inequalities versus the city. So even in that choice, it's a limited choice. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Just the same question for you. How about you? Your knowledge the information, or maybe in a higher level, the knowledge you have, has that ever prevented you to do something or
Well, I think I feel the mental burden of the knowledge sometimes when I had a baby a couple years ago, and I was very aware of my choices and products and organic food, and I know there's some low-level consequences of these choices on my health, but I also felt very frustrated because I thought I shouldn't have to be worrying about this, and I shouldn't have to. Definitely somebody else shouldn't have to worry about this, plus, how sustainable is my diet, plus every other choice. So I think it, makes me a little bit angry that this is something that we, should have to worry about at an individual level.
Yeah. How is the baby doing?
Baby's great. Yeah.
Baby's great. Good. How about you, Robert? Have your background, the knowledge you have, how does it have impact on your...
I think it makes you more humble and more compassionate for people who don't have the same level as health as you have, because it's not always their own fault, and that's like the main message we like to bring or give in our society is your health is your own individual responsibility.
Yeah,
which is a lie, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that knowledge makes you more compassionate. Should make you more compassionate.
Should make you compassionate. Okay, great. Okay. Are there right now any questions from the audience for our four panel members? So I see a couple of hands over there. So please raise your hand, and my colleague will come to you. Yes, please. Please stand up so that people can see you, and good in the microphone. Yeah.
Okay. I have kind of two-tier question. First is, how, at what level of kind of micro measurement can you really place issues within a city? Can you go up to a street level, to part of the street? How, because you need, obviously, if you're going to fight it, you need to have the tools to identify the problems. And then that's the one thing, how good can you measure it? And the other thing is, how do you have any kind of suggestions for policy, but like on a neighborhood level, because we're talking about not even city council, but Amsterdam is, for example, divided into local councils. So local council can actually have influence on a certain street by certain actions. How much can we actually do to change that?
Okay, cool. And by the way, Julian, if you want to add something, please raise your hand, and I will give you the floor if you feel that's a question toward you. So who will answer those questions? Robert?
Well, I think as far as measurement go, we can go pretty deep. I don't think it's like individual households, but we can go as close to street level, I think, neighborhood level, most of the times. But the real question, I think, is do we always need to go that deep in our quest for information? Because some things you don't have to deal with on a street level. You can also just do it as a society, like being more. It's about solidarity, right? So a lot of stuff is about solidarity. So providing social support, income support. You don't have to do it at street level or individual household level. You have to do it as a society. Other things, I agree, you have to maybe deal with at a more micro level. So we have to make a distinction, I think, with what we want to do and at what level you want to get your information.
Okay. By the way, I have a question. You want to add something?
Yeah, no, I wanted to add to that I do think what is relevant for individuals is to have a little bit of access to information, especially also in relation to times. So, for instance, knowing that when it's busy in traffic, that it's good to not have your windows open on the front side of the house. Those type of small things can maybe help people. But at the same time, indeed, I think, you don't necessarily need to know everything to prove that it's harmful or that it can harm communities, and depending on your susceptibility and your DNA. But, so I think that might help you with that.
Okay. By the way, I have a question for Julian. While I'm asking my colleagues, to fix the tablet, because I don't see any questions coming up. So I'm going to ask my colleague to take the tablet, and please take the tablet. Yes. Thank you so much. Because Julian, when we talk about the streets, and you had some ideas about the notion of complete street. Could you please elaborate about that while my colleagues are fixing the tablet for me? Wait a minute. Please start again because I didn't hear you. Please, please.
Well, I'm going to say yes and no. I think we're jumping around too much here. You're just throwing out questions. So I'm going to follow on, actually, by talking a little bit about a very provocative idea that came out of Harvard University, that your zip code is more important than your genetic code in determining your lifespan. And this was based on some research done in St. Louis. And they looked at a boulevard. North of the boulevard was a largely African-American community, and south of the boulevard was a largely white community, literally across one boulevard. The lifespan differences were about 15 years, depending on which side you were on. It was more polluted on the African-American side than the other side. So I think this is a very worrying idea that your zip code in the United States is more important than your genetic code. Now, what's really interesting for me, as you said, I grew up in the UK. You guys are in the Netherlands. We all have racism, but it's very peculiar the way it acts in the United States, because I've looked at UK urban planning, and I'm pretty sure it's the same with Dutch urban planning. There is no racist motive in the laws of British urban planning. Whereas if you look at US urban planning, it was configured around segregation and white supremacy. Whether it was covenants that said who could buy or rent in a neighborhood, whether it was the zoning laws that initially, until 1917, were racist, and the Supreme Court struck that down in 1917. So cities started to do what was called single-family zoning, making housing really expensive on large lots. This is called exclusionary zoning as well. And then we had redlining. And you said cities are hotter than the surrounding countryside. Well, it's not that cities are hotter, it's that black neighborhoods in cities are hotter than the white neighborhoods. So in the US, urban planning has become the spatial toolkit of white supremacy, and we can do something about that. Now, going to your question about complete streets, which just seemed to me to be kind of out of the blue. Look, you have Woonerf in the Netherlands. We're playing catch up with what we call complete streets. Streets where the sidewalk is enhanced. Streets where there's bike lanes, streets where there is climate adaptation measures. These are complete streets, but typically for the US, it costs a lot more to live in neighborhoods with slower traffic, complete streets, etc. My question is, who gets to decide what a complete street is? And I'll give you a good example. The city of Los Angeles, believe it or not, the motor capital, has a complete streets policy, and it's doing a lot of good work. But until very recently, the Southeast Asian and Latinx communities, or any communities, were not allowed to do street vending. Now, anybody who's been to Latin America or Southeast Asia will realize that part of the culture is street vending, food from the street. How can you say you have a complete streets policy when you've banned this legitimate cultural enterprise? Now, I have to say, 2 years ago, LA relaxed the laws and they now permit street vending. But it gives you that example. Complete streets for who? Who gets to say what a complete street is? And also, the people who design complete streets are urban designers. They are physically trained. They don't understand the sociology, the social ecology of streets. And streets are places. Streets are places that are undergoing change. So merely physically designing a complete street is not enough. That street has to be co-produced with the communities. And just a little point about your theme here, designing cities. I would have thought you would have put co-designing cities or co-producing cities, because I think I don't want to see experts designing cities. We've tried that and it hasn't worked. We need co-design and co-production. So I'll leave it there.
Great, especially the final point he raised, about engaging health workers or health scientists to design the city. We can talk about that when we are talking about solutions for our problems. Can we agree about that to talk about that question? Because I saw a question over there. So please raise your hand and my colleague will come to you with the microphone. Yes, please. What's your question, please? Yes.
My name is Ajay. I have a question for Julian and Daphina. Julian, you mentioned that there can be no environmental sustainability without social justice. I am a sustainability professional and I am a person of color. And it seems to me like the consequences of not addressing climate change in the most effective, quickest way possible might be greater than actually doing it any other way. And is the price of not solving climate in the most effective way not greater than the ideal, yet potentially less effective way of only tackling them together? That's my first question. And my second question is,
Excuse me, was it a question or was it a statement?
No, it's a question because
Cool. Okay, question. Cool. Go on with the second one.
Because it seems like we have to do both together, but the quicker way to solve climate change could sometimes be doing it separately, without addressing justice.
Yeah.
And I ask this because I'm also working in that. I work in climate transparency. I have a company that quantifies the product-wise climate impact for supermarkets and helps them pick better products. I went to University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and we have a set of master's students from there who are working on this environment, including environmental justice in what we do. And it seems to me like the solution to inequality is just like solving structural racism and basically wealth and income inequality itself. So what else can any business do, and we in particular, to include justice in every climate solution or climate strategy? Other than solving structural racism and wealth inequality itself, how else can businesses and individuals sort of do something about this?
Okay, question was for you, but Daphina, yeah?
I think for Patrick, right?
Not for anyone else.
Can I take a first shot at it?
Yeah.
Okay, so one of my biggest issues with climate change and the rhetoric and policy around it is that it often indeed doesn't include a justice perspective. So for instance, here in the Netherlands, we're very much interested in the energy transition. So going into solar, windmills, all of those things. But if we don't address the justice issue, we will continue to make these products such as solar panels from through mining that actually causes a lot of environmental degradation, that actually subjugates people, oppresses communities. So you can't really address climate without addressing underlying justice issues, because you're going to make the problem even worse. So we're going to have to find ways to do that energy transition in a just way, and that can be by indeed looking at what type of products do we use, where do we get those products from, how do we make it, and also talking about how do we divide responsibility. So maybe this whole energy transition is also a way to indeed talk about things such as solidarity, such as actually cutting back on things. So there are, degrowth communities that we can also be critical of, but there are ways
cutting back on what, for example?
Cutting back on certain lifestyles, trying to figure out not just what the minimum standard is, which is often what we look at in the human rights perspective, but also what is the maximum. So what can we maximally claim as communities, especially
in order to do that, should we redesign our laws?
Could be, yes. I think property laws, private property laws, are a very large problem of why we cannot reallocate, why we cannot redistribute certain things, why we cannot reclaim land to be used for other things. So those are indeed part of it, certain regulations that we have currently.
Okay, cool. Okay. I don't know why I'm looking at you, because but the guy who asked the question, he looked at you.
No, I think it was
Julian.
But
Julian.
yeah.
Julian,
He's
would
on
you?
the
Yeah.
screen there. I
Yeah.
think.
So there was a question for you as well, Julian.
Yeah, well, I'm going to answer the first part of his question because I think it is a pretty important issue. So the questioner, as I understand it, is saying, do we have time to integrate justice concerns when basically we've got a crisis? And I agree with his premise. We do have a crisis, but we have to integrate justice concerns. Let me give you an example. We've done a lot of work here in Boston because, as you know, Boston's got a big harbor. If it wasn't Sandy Hook in New York that got it 5 years ago or so, it would have been Boston if the storm had moved further up the coast. We're looking at that big storm coming. We're getting a lot of new condominium developments, a lot of new apartment developments in a place called East Boston, which is traditionally low income, and it is Latinx, Latin American communities. And these new condo buildings are being built above a certain height. They've got all the latest technologies, all the latest laws. The city council is putting money in with the private sector to develop these condos. And research is showing that it will actually make, these condos will be high and dry if there's a flood, but it will make it worse for those poor people in East Boston. So we're doing climate resilience work and ignoring justice. And so, Ajay, to your question, climate change is happening because of injustice. We cannot ignore injustice in its resolution. And you might say, well, how is climate change part of injustice? Well, look at the parts of the world that are being first and worst affected. Look at who is being affected and what responsibility they have for generating carbon. Now, I want to leave you with one quick thought. Some work was done in the UK where they looked at consumption, basically, and the consumption and inequality across the world. And here's the headline. Poverty isn't the biggest issue we face, it is inequality. And the countries with a bigger gap between rich and poor have bigger carbon footprints. Isn't that incredible? Bigger carbon footprints correlate with inequality. Advertisers and advertising revenues are bigger in countries with greater inequality. So advertisers are using inequality to sell more products, which drives our carbon footprint, which drives climate change. Inequality is a major driver of climate change. How on earth, Ajay, we can take inequality out of the equation when it is one of the major drivers of climate change? And I think, to Daphne's point, it just doesn't make sense. We have to do this. You know, if one of your solutions, Ajay, is geoengineering, where are these carbon dumps going to go? Is it going to be like the old environmental justice things of, you know, the power stations in the low-income neighborhoods, the polluting power plants? Is that what's going to happen when carbon technologies take off, that they will be placed very conveniently in lower-income neighborhoods? Now, we cannot take justice out of the equation. We're in the mess we are in now because justice has been ignored.
Wow, well spoken, man. Well spoken. Robert, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, because I totally agree, and we already see it happening, right? So we in the Netherlands, we talk about how to combat climate change, and we talk about greening our energy supply.
Yeah.
But where do we plant? Where do we design all those solar plants and solar parks?
Yeah.
They're not in the cities. They're in the parts of the Netherlands in which we pretend nobody lives, the countryside.
Yeah.
And they don't really like that.
Yeah.
It's also about legitimacy. It's about getting support for the things we need to do. You have to take into account social justice.
Yeah. By the way, just thank you very much for this. Now, question for both of you. With the knowledge of your researchers, now I'm looking at you. How can we fight inequality with the things you research?
Yeah, well, I think one thing is quantifying inequality. So looking at air quality, for instance, we know that minority groups in the Netherlands have worse air quality than Dutch. And even if we separate this, talking about intersections, if we control or adjust for income and assets, then we still see that. So if I'm not the majority group in the Netherlands, I have worse air quality. And even if I'm richer or in a higher socioeconomic position and I'm a minority, I still have, on average, worse air quality. So I think quantifying that, acknowledging that, and then starting to redesign to address that is the first step. And I think we talked a little bit about susceptibility. Also, I think, integrating that knowledge, not about genetic susceptibility, but to the wear and tear that we experience throughout our life. So a community or a person perhaps that's marginalized or stressed for certain reasons throughout their whole life will be more susceptible to environmental insults. So what can we do to rectify that and to provide more information or more access to help deal with that?
Yeah. Same questions for you, Robert. With your research, with the things you do, how can we use that to fight inequality?
Well, it's about being aware of the intersections and the interactions, right? So it's like Patrick said, we have to take into account social justice with anything we do, if only to get the legitimacy for the actions we take, but also to fully grasp the consequences of what we do, whether we're designing cities or building solar plants or building a nuclear power plant. It has benefits, but it also has consequences, and those consequences are not equally distributed among the population.
Yeah. So there is a question that maybe, has some similarities with just what I asked. I look at you, but I'll look at you as well, Someone sent a question. We still have lots of body products with plastic in it, shampoos, lotions. Do companies have too much power to change this? Or our politicians are too lazy? Why aren't we moving forward? Same with lead in water. In other words, there is information, there is knowledge. Yeah. When and how are we going to put it in maybe law or actions? Maybe they are the same or not.
Yeah, I think, I'd love to hear about the legal aspects of this from the work that we do. We're interested in risk assessment, and that's often at the government level, not at companies. So companies are involved in generating knowledge to know how to do risk assessment, but we have a justice issue, for instance, female reproductive health. We don't have as many tools to assess that as male reproductive health. Or susceptible communities, we're not looking always at how to look at susceptible groups. But I think from the one thing I'd like to talk about also from the justice perspective is we maybe want to regulate for safer products here, but what about the fact that we're outsourcing our pollution, that we're sending, we use a ton of plastic here, we recycle, we feel good, we pat ourselves on the back, but what are we doing, as you talked about, where are we extracting that, where are we sending that, and what is our responsibility as a nation, as an individual for that life cycle of that product?
Yes. So from the legal perspective, what is challenging is that law kind of goes along with power. So what we see often is that a lot of the regulation is actually in support of companies or is actually in support of the polluters. So it's really up for us, the ones that are voting, the ones that are trying to put pressure to change that. Because what we see sometimes with the laws is that they, for instance, with air pollution, they do say a certain standard, but they count it or they measure it over a month, even though that we know that there are spike moments when actually the air quality is harmful to people. But those spikes we actually don't take into consideration because we look at the average over a month. So those type of things are the parts of law that kind of facilitate certain pollution. And that is something that we need to create awareness of, but also vote against or try to argue with your local councilman or those type of avenues to get that changed. Because I think these type of issues that we're experiencing cannot, they will continue and they will not change unless there is a lot of pushback. And that is with a lot of the things that we experience and the challenges that we have, I think.
So what are you saying? Is it like an optimistic message or pessimistic message? In a way, it sounded like you said, we have all the knowledge and the information, But as long as we don't put it in our politics with our voting, it doesn't pay anything.
Well, I think that we at this table have the information, but I think a lot of people don't have the information about how the environment is impacting them, how stress impacts them, how it accumulates. So I think we can definitely gain something in that perspective. But also we need to remember that everything is connected, unfortunately, to politics, to power. And you can only counter that by either mobilizing, taking certain companies to court. But all of those things need to be done together to even make a little bit of change.
Okay. There was a question over there. Is the question someone raised a hand over there? Otherwise, we go there. There is a question over there. Yes, please. Yeah. Raise your hand, please, so you can see. Yes, over there. Yeah. Please stand up. And what's your question?
Thank you. I had a question for Julian. Specifically, you were talking about the cities of belonging concept, which sounds very interesting to me. And I personally, when I hear that, I think of more social and cultural things that provide that bond for how you experience the city. So what might be spatial or design indicators or contributors towards that emotion?
Great question. Thank you. If I'd done a presentation, I would have spent about 5 minutes talking about what I see as the tension with us, sustainability, urban design, city building freaks, the tension between what the city can become and who gets to belong. We've put too much effort into becoming sustainable, becoming a healthy city, becoming a resilient city, becoming a sharing city. But who gets to belong? We're increasingly, certainly here in the US, and I know around the world, we're denying belonging. Homophobia, racism, Islamophobia, gentrification, moving underhoused and homeless people from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So we have a tension between what the city can become, and I don't want to be part of a city elite deciding on what the city can become. I want as many people as want to be part of the city having a right to the city and a right to decide what the city should become. So I think there is this tension. So there are those structural issues, but there are also design issues. Now, when I think about designing the city, I think about space, public space and place. We all have different positionalities. As a Black heterosexual man, I experience space differently to other people who are not Black heterosexual men. We all experience spaces differently. So I see the city as a set of potential spaces of engagement, places where we can meet in the presence of others. What are those spaces? Well, there's a really good book by a sociologist at Yale University, and he talks about the Cosmopolitan Canopy, okay? The Cosmopolitan Canopy. And he identifies especially food places. And he talks about the Reading Terminal Market in Philadelphia as being this place where people sit in mixed groups and talk and watch a ball game and eat food from different cultures. And it's as if there are no barriers. I take my dog to the dog park. We all talk about the dogs. We don't talk about, each other. We are introduced to each other through our dogs. And you can engage in politics if you want, but it's a space of engagement where we meet people who are different to us. Similarly, kids' spaces. Kids like to go and play. The parents and guardians will sit around. So there we have 3 potential spaces of engagement. How do we, as urban planners, urban designers, create spaces of engagement? Because, and I'll leave you on this point, there's a very important social science theory called contact theory. It's really simple. The more contact we have with people who are different from us in all forms, the more likely we are to be tolerant, empathetic towards their needs. That's the way we need to go. I want to see urban planning orientating towards creating an urban cosmopolitan canopy, a place, a space of engagement where we can feel free to engage across difference. And you only have to look at the results of Brexit in Britain It wasn't the big cities that said, let's get out. It was the little rural areas where people are fearful of the other, the immigrant, because they watch TV that says these immigrants are going to take your jobs, your men and women, and blah, 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 blah. No, people who grew up in multicultural, intercultural environments, most of them are happy with that, and most of them seek out that form of living. So becoming and belonging is a really important tension, and we need, as urban planners, urban designers, city builders, we need to put more effort into the belonging aspect. We must never stop dreaming about what the city can become. That's where urban planning started. Dreamers, Ebenezer Howard, people thinking of a better way to live and organize our human enterprise. But we do need to think about who can belong, because we are wasting a lot of urban dwellers who are just moving into the suburban areas or cheaper areas, and they can't live in the city anymore.
Julian, it's a shame that you couldn't see the faces of our audience while you were mentioning all those examples of kids or people in Philadelphia sitting or dogs. They were all like smiling and nodding. Oh yeah, I realize that I can. And even when you talk about kids, what did you recognize?
I definitely recognize that, although I must say it still depends a little bit on which neighborhood you're in about how diverse and accessible it is for different types of people. But I'm happy. I want to maybe acknowledge some of the positive things happening in the Netherlands. Much can be done, but I think there's some real effort to evaluate the impact of urban design and some newer developments in some of the cities. So I think there's been some. And I'd like to hear more what other people think about how successful the co-creation has been, but some effort to acknowledge that we have life discrepancy differences within one city. What can we do to reduce that? How are we going to evaluate the impact of our designs in the cities? And I think that's really nice to witness.
Maybe we can ask you a question, or in general, this is a very specific or general, focusing on building resilience. How would you do that?
So I think the word resilience is sometimes also a bit challenging. I think because a lot of communities are actually made vulnerable. So I like to talk more about taking away certain structures or taking away certain structures of inequality. Cool. But indeed, it starts off by figuring out what happens, how people are impacted, and then what do people need to be able to deal with those impacts. And that indeed comes from issues such as co-creation, trying to increase also access to information, participation, co-creating designs. But that takes a lot of time and effort. And I think indeed communities, but also local governments, the general government needs to be able to put more emphasis on that, on how are we going to move forward. Because like we've mentioned, people are actually, their lives are being shortened. And I think that in itself is something that is worth addressing if we can. If we can prevent that from happening, then we should put all efforts in that.
Okay. There's a question over there. Please keep your hand raising, and my colleague will come to you. Please.
Hi, my name is Rick Amato. It's a question for Julian. Following up on what you just said, I work in education, actually specifically in urban design of the building of schools, and noticed the isolation that sometimes causes, inadvertently often. It happens tonight downstairs in Pakhuis de Zwijger. There's a big conference with the city aldermen focused on education. I was going to go there, but I thought you guys actually have the fundamental ideas here about the social aspects, environmental justice, and related to these kinds of social infrastructure. If you could tell the aldermen one thing, or more than one thing, about the place of education in our cities, especially primary education, in addressing these challenges, what would that be?
Thank you very much. And Julian, you start off, please, and I will give the same question for you if you want to add something what Julian is going to tell us. Please.
Well, yeah, and I'll keep it brief. I mean, great question. Look, the place of education, I mean, it's like breathing. It's fundamental. Not only for personal gain for each individual student, but for what they can do for their communities. I think it's important that we look at, education not only as the written curriculum, but what's called the hidden curriculum. The hidden curriculum is the way that our values, social values, are passed on through schools. And we need to look at that because, in many cases, if you look at the most successful nation education, it's Finland. They don't give homework. Their teachers are extremely well qualified and extremely well paid and extremely well regarded. The kids the dominant paradigm is flourishing. How do we develop the flourishing child? Not how do we develop the child who can pass the Massachusetts exams here in Massachusetts, or I'm sure, you have similar things in the Netherlands. So, education for flourishing, I think, is what I would ask these people to think about. And I'll leave you with a thought. When I started my career 40 years ago, this year, I was a high school geography teacher. And I remember at the end of my first year, a kid comes up to me called David. And he said, he looked at me in the eyes, and I still well up in my own eyes when I think of this. He said, "Sir, what do dumb kids like me do now we've finished our exams?" What do dumb kids like me do now we've finished our exams? David wasn't dumb. He wasn't the brightest kid, but he wasn't dumb. Yet the hidden curriculum, the stares, the glances, the grades, everything had told him, you're dumb. We were dumb because we didn't find out what he was good at. We didn't understand the theory of multiple intelligences, and that David was probably a very socially intelligent guy, but didn't do so well on cognitive exams. So I would say to these people, yes, let's look at education as a journey towards human flourishing, not towards producing, cookie cutter cutouts for this dysfunctional industrial society that we have.
Thank you so much. And I just wonder, what happened to David, Maybe next time, we speak to you, we can explore that, if you can look him up.
The interesting thing is, David is just one person. Yeah. There are millions, if not billions, around the world who are failing to reach their potential. Yeah. They, in Amartya Sen's terms, they are being denied the capabilities to succeed. Cool. And that's you see, that's another point about just sustainability. So many people will say, hey, look at environmental destruction. We're destroying the rainforests. There might be a cure for cancer in the rainforests. Well, David might have had a cure for cancer in his brain, but we didn't get it out of it. We didn't allow him to get it out. Yeah. The wasting of human potential is every bit as tragic as the wasting of environmental potential. Just sustainabilities is about increasing human potential as well as increasing environmental potential.
Well spoken again. Thank you, Julian. We are going to enter our final 10 minutes for this conversation. So are there any questions, or let's say burning questions? Over there, yes, there is a hand. Please stand up, and what's your question, please?
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Going back to the differences between rural and urban areas, and also suburbia that you just mentioned. What do you all think is the fate of rural and suburban areas in the face of climate crisis, and of course of all of these health issues that are better addressed in cities, and that we pay more attention to them in cities because of course there's more of us and the differences are more noticeable. But then, what happens with them? How do we focus on them? How do we pay attention to them? Okay. To not leave them forgotten while we're solving health in our cities.
Robert, would it be a question for you, especially?
I don't know if it's a question for me specifically, but I can try to answer the question.
Yes.
It's a very, very, very good point. I think we need to stop thinking about cities as a distinct entity, totally closed off of its environment. It's there's like a city cannot exist without a countryside, a rural area, suburbia, and they need each other. And in the Netherlands, we tend to focus on what we call the Randstad, the city belt, and a few other places, and we tend to forget that's what I said earlier. We like to pretend that nobody lives in the countryside, at least nobody important. No, but that's the way we look at it, right? So, people living in those areas feel that as well. So they feel neglected, either justly or unjustly, but they feel it. And I think if we look at the Netherlands, which is a very small country, as an area in which you have urbanized areas and less urbanized areas, which really need each other to tackle very serious issues like climate change and the energy transformation. We need to acknowledge that there are people living there that want things, that need things, like schools, for example, or health facilities, which tend to get taken out or cut back in those areas. And we need to rethink our relationship as city dwellers with the surrounding country, because we need them. We really do need them to tackle those issues. And by doing so, I also think we give them better chances to be healthier, because you said, well, living in the countryside is maybe healthier. Maybe in some rural areas, but there are areas in the Netherlands which are deprived, not only in income, but also very much in health, which are not cities at all. They're rural areas at the border of a country. So I think we need to reassess our relationship as city dwellers with the surrounding country, and by doing so, and by bringing into account social justice or equality or solidarity, I don't really. It doesn't really matter how you call it, but we need to do that to establish a healthy community in the Netherlands.
Daphina, we started off with you, and you are our fellow for this whole journey. And I wonder, can we finish up with you as well? Do you have like a final thought? Like a Jerry Springer final thought for us?
Oh, Jerry Springer, I don't know, but
yeah, you probably have something for us.
No, I definitely think I really enjoyed this conversation. By the way, I think it was really fruitful to get all of these different perspectives on this topic. And I think especially in relation to solidarity, I think that is something that has returned on how we need to deal with this, how we need to deal with environmental justice, how we need to readdress certain issues, how we need to deal with reallocation. So that is hopefully that I can give to everyone to think about that. What are you willing to give up? What are you understanding about your relationship with others, and how will you try to mobilize around that? And indeed, understanding that it's not only you responsible for it, but it's actually a structural issue in the bigger picture when we think of these things.
Yeah. So combining micro and meta level together. Yeah. And very interesting what you said, because sometimes we know what you want, but what are you willing to give up? Very challenging, interesting notion. What are you going to give up to reach that goal? Very interesting. And how about you? Do you have any final thought for us? Final remark?
Just that I'd love to continue this for much longer, because I think the giving up discussion is starting to happen, and I think that's really promising. And I think Corona was a wonderful pause, but I guess I'm a little bit also nervous that we're rushing back to how it was before, and it wasn't enough of a pause as we'd hoped. So
Robert?
Yeah, I also enjoyed the discussion, and I really enjoyed which makes it a bit daunting is that everything's related, and that sounds a bit like an open door. But it is reality, and we can only tackle the big issues if we take into account that health, justice, and climate change, for example, they're related, and you can't battle one without addressing the other.
Yeah. And Jonathan, the final question, or floor for you. It's almost 9:30 in Holland. We are going to have a beer, downstairs. And so, what's the final things you want to give to us, to spend hours here in Amsterdam, on this nice warm Monday here?
Well, lots of thoughts, but and I'm not going to claim this quote as my own, but I think it is very provocative. Sustainable development means using our unlimited mental resources, not our limited natural resources. And I think that's a hugely provocative and important thing to say. It means that really sustainable development is about reconfiguring our brains rather than just, continuing to despoil the beautiful planet that we have. And when you think about it, there is this concept. I don't know whether any of you have got into this, but so we think of the totality of rocks on the planet as the lithosphere, water as the hydrosphere. So the concept of the brain that we all have and its integration is called the noosphere. This idea of the noosphere and the idea that we have this huge generative organ in our heads. How much are we really using it towards sustainability? We have the science of sustainability. What we don't have is the social science, which is basically how do we get our leaders committed and how do we get the public to sign up to something very differently for different communities. But how do we get a commitment to that? Sustainable development means using our unlimited mental resources, not our limited natural resources.
Cool. Thank you very much. Thank you very much over there, Julian. Of course, thank you, our audience, and the people who joined us through online. Thank you so much for your participation. And if you like this program, most probably you would like to see the next chapter next Monday, 23rd of May. And the title would be Climate and the Kingdom. Climate and the Kingdom. And so if you want, by the way, you want to hear more about her work, Daphina, we have made a podcast. It's very easily to find through all the mainstream podcast providers. So go and hear and listen to that. And if you have any, let's say, money left, in this, the dark days, for us, pay as you like. If you like this program, pay as you like, So you will see in a couple of seconds, you will see a QR code, so you can pay as you like. And having said that,
And there's also a book club. Sorry.
What?
There's also a book club coming up on Wednesday.
Wow,
Yes.
book club. Okay, cool. Having said that, thank you again, and I hope to see you next Monday. And you can watch this episode very soon on YouTube and our channel. On that note, I would say thanks again, and let's go to the bar and have a drink. Bye-bye, everybody.
I thought it was the soundless. Yeah, I also did this once before, yeah.
The thing is, I'm just never gonna be
But it was
production
so
leader.
good.